Picking up from our discussion on the general objects and methods of philosophy, let's zoom in on a specific domain, psychology. The core mission here is pretty straightforward. We want to map out the landscape of consciousness. Think of it as creating an atlas for the inner world, identifying different territories, or still states of consciousness, and figuring out how they relate to each other. But right off the bat, we hit a snag. What exactly are we studying? Because the phenomena we call psychological often look suspiciously like their physiological cousins. It's like trying to tell apart the shadow puppet and the hand that makes it move. We need to draw a clear line between the body's goings-on and the soul's experiences. Let's first define the physiological side of the coin. Imagine watching a clockwork mechanism. That's physiology in a nutshell. These phenomena are firmly rooted in space. You can pinpoint where they happen, describe them as movements, maybe even sketch a diagram of nerve impulses firing off. Because they're spatial, we can measure them, calculate the area, the volume, the distance traveled. Crucially, they operate largely outside our conscious awareness. Think about your heart beating, or blood flowing through veins. You don't feel the individual cells moving, right? You might feel the result if something goes wrong, like pain from a cut. But the underlying physiological processes themselves are unconscious events happening in your body. And when we talk about these processes, we usually say the body does this or the body suffers this. Attributing it directly to I, the self, feels a bit like saying the car driver caused the engine to turn over. The driver initiates the action, but the engine's internal workings endure the process. Now flip the coin to the psychological side. This is where things get ethereal. Psychological phenomena aren't stuck in space. You can't point to a spot in your brain and say, "There's my thought about blueberries." They unfold purely in time, like a fleeting melody or a sudden insight. We can only measure how long they last, not their spatial dimensions. Most importantly, they are conscious. You are aware of them as they happen. You feel the sensation arise, notice the thought pop into your head, experience the emotion wash over you all through the lens of your own consciousness. And here's the kicker. We attribute these experiences directly to ourselves. I am happy, I am thinking, I am afraid. Even if the initial trigger was external or physiological, the experience itself belongs to the self. This fundamental difference in nature-space versus time, unconsciousness versus consciousness, body versus self sets psychology apart from physiology. Okay, so if psychological states are inherently subjective and non-spatial, how do we even begin to study them scientifically? Enter Gustav Fechner and Ernst Weber, pioneers of psychophysics. Their big idea was to apply the rigor of mathematics to the study of sensation. Remember, measuring duration is easier than intensity, so they focused there. Fechner laid down some ground rules for measurement. You need a standard, something independent to measure against. And the thing itself must be measurable. For sensation, what could be the standard? They proposed excitation, the physical stimulus causing the sensation. Think about lifting weights. You know precisely how much weight you're adding, that's the excitation. The question is, how does the change in weight relate to the change in the feeling of effort or heaviness? That's the sensation. So, how did they try to measure this relationship? Not by asking, is this feeling twice as strong as that one? Which sounds impossible. Instead, they used a clever trick, measuring the smallest difference you can detect. Imagine holding a 100-gram weight. Add 1 gram, feel nothing. Add another 2 grams, still nothing? Keep adding until that extra bit finally registers as heavier. On average, you'd need to add about 33 grams to that initial 100 grams for the difference to become noticeable. This just noticeable difference becomes their unit. Now, here's the math part, and it gets a bit abstract. If 1 J&D equals 1 unit of sensation, then 2 J&Ds should equal 2 units, and so on. But crucially, to get that second J&D, you often need to double the original excitation. So the numbers go like this: sensation 1, 2, 3 corresponds to excitation 1, 2, 4, 8. Plotting these points gives us a logarithmic curve. The famous Fechner's law, S equals K log. Basically, the perceived intensity of a sensation grows much slower than the actual physical intensity of the stimulus. Double, the light intensity doesn't make the perceived brightness double. It makes it seem only slightly brighter. But hold on, this elegant law wasn't without controversy. First off, some pointed out the math itself had issues. More fundamentally, the whole approach rested on shaky ground. Why assume that sensations just add up? Why not multiply them, or use some other mathematical operation? Think about forces in physics. We say force A is twice force B because we see their effects on an object, one makes it accelerate twice as fast. But take away the object, take away space, and those forces become pure abstractions, hard to compare directly. Same problem with sensations. We can only measure their effects, like duration, or maybe behavioral responses, not the sensations themselves. We're measuring the shadow, not the object casting it. The very concept of measuring intensity directly seems flawed when the phenomenon is inherently non-spatial and subjective. Another major blow came from the side of physiology. Critics argued that psychophysics completely ignored the middleman, the body's own processing. Fechner and Weber were looking straight from physical stimulus to psychological sensation. But what about the nerve impulses, the brain activity, the chemical messengers in between? The body isn't just a passive wire transmitting signals, it actively modifies them. Think about how different people perceive the same loud noise, or how fatigue changes your sensitivity. The body's state matters immensely. So, any decent theory needs to account for this physiological layer. You need to understand how the physical world translates into physiological signals, and how those signals translate into our conscious experiences. Psychophysics, by skipping the middle step, was seen as fundamentally incomplete. Faced with these criticisms, Wilhelm Wundt stepped up and founded the psychophysiological school. He basically said, okay, you're right, we can't ignore the body, let's refocus. Wundt's big idea was that consciousness isn't directly linked to raw physics, but to physiology. The mind, according to Wundt, is deeply dependent on the body. Our conscious life springs from the unconscious biological processes going on within us. The immediate trigger for any mental event, any psychic phenomenon, is some kind of physiological state or process in the brain or nerves. He kept the scientific ideal of measurement, but shifted focus away from the tricky business of intensity towards measuring duration, how long a sensation lasts. So, the new game plan was, study the link between mind and body, specifically focusing on physiological correlates and the timing of mental events. Now, Wundt's approach seemed promising, focusing on the tangible physiological basis. But critics, including the author of this text, pushed back again. Studying the mind-body connection is undoubtedly useful, they argued, but it's not enough. It's like saying we don't need botany or zoology, just study the relationship between plants and soil. No, we need to understand the plants themselves, their structures, their functions, their diversity. Similarly, we need a pure psychology, a science dedicated solely to understanding the facts of consciousness, describing them accurately, classifying them systematically, before we can even think about linking them to the body. You can't build a solid bridge between two fields if you haven't fully understood either shore. First, you need a solid science of the mind and a solid science of the body, each with its own inventory of phenomena. So, what's the alternative path? The text argues forcefully for a return to basics. We must study states of consciousness in and for themselves. How? Through direct observation, introspection, if you will, but framed as a scientific method. But immediately objections fly up. Is this even possible? First, critics say it's too hard. Mental events are fleeting, like catching smoke. Can you really scrutinize them closely? And isn't our internal gaze, our consciousness, observing itself, too crude and imprecise to capture details? Second, isn't it logically impossible? How can the same mind be both the actor doing something and the spectator watching itself do it? You can't be both, on stage and in the audience, at the exact same moment. Third, even if possible, wouldn't this just lead to anecdotal reports about individuals, lacking any real scientific generality? Would psychology just become a collection of interesting case studies? The text pushes back against these objections. Regarding difficulty, well, aren't moralists, satirists, and artists constantly doing this? They claim to grasp the nuances of the inner world all the time. And yes, mental events are fast, but memory is our lab bench. We can bring fleeting thoughts back into conscious view to examine them leisurely, just like we study a butterfly pinned under glass. As for impossibility, the actor/spectator argument is dismissed as semantic quibbling. Can you be an actor and a spectator simultaneously? No, but can you be an actor and watch yourself act? Absolutely. Think about seeing your reflection in a mirror while you move. Or the common phrase, listen to oneself speak. Finally, on the scientificity issue, we study the common in the particular, just like a mathematician studies the properties shared by all triangles by examining one specific triangle. Comparing our findings with others reveals universal patterns. History offers valuable data too, though we must be careful not to overgeneralize from the deeds of great men. We need to understand the common human condition first. All right, having defended the method of observation, we now turn to applying it. What are we actually looking for in this inner landscape? The goal is to list, describe, and classify the various states of consciousness. To avoid getting lost in the sheer variety, we need a systematic approach. We'll look for common threads, recurring themes, and group similar experiences together. Each distinct category of activity or experience will correspond to what the text calls a faculty of the soul. Think of it like this. Just as inorganic matter has properties like density or hardness, and living organisms have functions like digestion or respiration, the soul has faculties. These aren't just labels for states. They represent fundamental modes or capacities of our conscious life. So, how many main categories, how many core faculties can we identify? The text proposes three. First, there's activity. This is the faculty of acting, doing things. We act on the outside world through our bodies, and on the inside world through willing, thinking, directing our attention. Second, there's sensibility. This is the faculty of experiencing pleasure and pain. Notice, these aren't active choices. They're passive responses to whether our actions flow smoothly or hit obstacles. When we act freely, we feel pleasure. When hindered, we feel pain. Third, there's intelligence. This is the faculty of knowing. It's the awareness that we are acting, suffering, or thinking. It's the faculty of representation, of consciousness itself. So we have activity, sensibility, and intelligence, the three pillars of the soul's operations. Now these faculties aren't just convenient labels. They are seen as real, inherent powers of the soul, rooted in its very essence. They exist whether or not we are actively engaged in a particular state. Think of them as the underlying machinery that produces the observable states. They are distinct from the states themselves. Some philosophers tried to boil everything down to one faculty. Condillac said it was all about sensibility, knowing via sensation. Maine de Biran focused on activity, muscular effort, and Spinoza's championed intelligence. But the text argues these are too different, action versus passivity versus representation. Another pitfall is imagining these faculties as separate entities housed in different parts of the body, like Plato did with reason in the head, spirit in the chest, and appetite in the belly. Nope. The text insists they are properties of a single unified self. Furthermore, these faculties never work in isolation. We always act based on reasons provided by intelligence and motives spurred by sensibility. As Aristotle put it, we live with the whole soul, not just one part. Let's dive deeper into one of these faculties, sensibility, the source of pleasure and pain. What are these things really? We can't give a perfect definition, but we can outline their key features. First, they are affective. We experience them passively. We don't choose to feel pleasure or pain. They happen to us. Sure, we react afterwards, trying to increase pleasure or decrease pain, but the feeling itself is largely involuntary. Second, they are necessary. We can't just switch them off. If an event occurs that typically causes pain or pleasure, the feeling follows necessarily. We can distract ourselves, yes, or focus intently to intensify the feeling, even finding pleasure in melancholy sometimes. But we can't eliminate the possibility of feeling them. This refutes the Stoic and Epicurean claims of achieving complete emotional detachment through willpower alone. Third, they are relative. What feels good to you might feel awful to me. The manual laborer enjoys physical work. The intellectual might find it tedious. Pleasure and pain are deeply subjective. So, what causes these feelings? One influential theory, championed by Schopenhauer, says pleasure is simply the absence of pain. Pain is the default state, and pleasure is just the relief from that pain. Think about wanting something. The desire itself is painful because you lack it. Only when you finally get it do you experience pleasure. If this is true, life sounds pretty bleak, doesn't it? Every little joy comes at the cost of prior suffering. Is it worth it? Schopenhauer famously said no. His follower von Hartmann agreed, arguing the total amount of pain outweighs the total amount of pleasure. But the text rejects this view. Think about eating when you're merely hungry, not starving. There's no preceding agony, just pure pleasure. Or consider the joy of receiving good news, or appreciating art. Where's the prior pain? So pleasure can exist independently. Another theory, going back to Aristotle and revived by Hamilton and Boulier, suggests pleasure comes from free activity. Doing things naturally brings delight, while constraint brings suffering. This explains why exercise, vibrant colors, or solving a puzzle feels good. But does it explain everything? What about the pain after exercising too much, or the restlessness after being bored for too long? The text proposes a refinement. Pleasure arises not just from freedom, but from free and varied activity. Variety keeps things interesting, and the anticipation of variety makes rest and youth enjoyable. Beyond just feeling pleasure or pain, our self tends to move towards what feels good and away from what feels bad. This tendency, this movement, is called an inclination. While related to sensibility, it's more about action than passive feeling. We can classify these inclinations based on what they're directed towards. There are three main types. First, egoistic inclinations, where the self is the target. These split into two: conservative inclinations, the basic instinct for self-preservation, the love of life itself, prioritizing basic needs, and acquisitive inclinations, the drive to add to what we already have, ambition seeking wealth, status, knowledge, etc., often captured by the Greek term pleonexia. Second, altruistic inclinations, directed towards other people. These include love for family, domestic, love for one's community or nation, social, and love for all of humanity higher. Third, higher inclinations, directed towards abstract ideals like truth, beauty, and goodness. These represent our striving towards the ideal. Do altruistic inclinations really exist, or are we just sophisticated egoists, as some thinkers like Hobbes and Rousseau suggested? The text acknowledges the debate, but asserts that we clearly do care about others. These altruistic feelings can be broken down further. First, the strongest bond, domestic inclinations, love for family. Then, social inclinations, extending care to our community, which has evolved over time from tribal groups to nations and civic bodies. Finally, the broadest scope, higher altruism, the love of humanity itself. These didn't appear all at once. Family love came first, then patriotism arose as societies formed, and eventually philosophies like Stoicism and religions spread the idea of universal love. Some argue these conflict: should we love family or country more? The text counters that they actually support each other. Society is built from families, and love for humanity encompasses both. It's a progression. Learning to love your family teaches you to love your community, which in turn teaches you to love all humankind. Finally, let's look at the third type of inclination, the higher inclinations. These are directed towards abstract ideals, the true, the beautiful, the good. Think of the philosopher's quest for wisdom, the artist's pursuit of beauty, the moral agent's commitment to virtue. What defines these inclinations? First, they are infinite or insatiable. Unlike wanting food or shelter, the more truth you discover, the more you want to know. The drive never fully satisfies. Second, they are impersonal. There's no jealousy involved. When you discover something beautiful, you don't want to keep it secret. You want to share the joy. When you learn the truth, you feel compelled to teach it, not hoard it. Interestingly, when these ideals are personified, like a god or a saint, this tendency towards the ideal naturally flows into religious sentiment. Looking across all these different inclinations, egoistic, altruistic, higher, a pattern emerges. They seem to unfold in two phases. Phase 1 is expansion. The self reaches out towards the desired object. This is essentially desire or need. Phase 2 is contraction. The self grasps the object, tries to assimilate it, make it part of itself, appropriate it exclusively. It's here in the second phase that egoism and jealousy typically enter the picture. Think about wanting a promotion. Phase 1, you desire it. Phase 2, you get it, and you start guarding it jealously. However, the text argues that not all inclinations go through both phases. The higher inclinations, like love for truth or beauty, often stop at phase 1. You enjoy the ideal, share it, but don't want to monopolize it. Similarly, some altruistic inclinations, like genuine maternal love, seem to be about the other person, not about fulfilling a self-centered need. These are disinterested inclinations, whose aim is never purely self-appropriation. We've talked about the general feelings of pleasure and pain, and the directed movements of inclinations. Now, let's look at the specific, often overwhelming, emotional responses that arise from the success or failure of our inclinations. These are emotions. Like pleasure and pain, they are passive affective states, but they differ in that they tend to engulf the entire self, unlike pleasure, which might be localized like tasting something delicious. Emotions are expansive and invasive. How can we categorize them? The text suggests looking at the dynamic relationship between the self and the object of inclination. Does the object approach, move away? Do we possess it securely? Fear losing it? This changing relationship generates different emotional landscapes. Let's map this out using an agreeable object as our example. Imagine a goal you want to achieve. When it's far off, just a dream, you feel a mix of hope and anxiety. As it gets closer, hope intensifies. Once you achieve it, hope gives way to pure joy. If you continue to possess it, the feeling shifts to a calmer sense of security. Now flip the script. Imagine fearing you might lose the object. This creates anxiety. If the threat becomes sudden and real, it's fear. Sudden deprivation leads to terror. If the object moves away from you after you had it, sadness or regret sets in. If it keeps moving away, sadness deepens into despair. And if the object remains infinitely distant, beyond your reach, you feel despondence. Spinoza famously analyzed these emotional dynamics in his Ethics. Beyond emotions, there's another category, passions. These are often seen as more intense, more overwhelming versions of emotions. Bossuet listed 11, Descartes tried to boil them down to admiration, and Spinoza identified joy and love as fundamental. But the text offers a clearer distinction. It defines passion as a sensory stimulation of particular intensity, characterized by violence. Think of it as an emotional storm breaking out. It's not just a gentle breeze or a moderate wave, it's a hurricane. This intensity can strike suddenly or build gradually, becoming habitual. Some passions are fleeting bursts, others are long-burning fires. What makes passion distinct? Two key characteristics. First off, like inclinations, passion is always directed towards something. You're passionate for a person, an idea, a goal. Emotions, by contrast, might be more general feelings without a specific target. Second, like emotions, passion is invasive. It takes over the whole self, concentrating all our energy and faculties on the object of passion. Inclinations, remember, are more localized. So passion is essentially a supercharged state of either an inclination or an emotion. Mild anger is an emotion, intense consuming anger is a passion. Fear becomes a passion when it grips you completely. Are passions always bad? Critics worry they impoverish the self, destroy balance, and lead to rashness. And yes, unchecked passion can be destructive. But the text argues for a more nuanced view. If reason intercedes, passion doesn't just consume, it can also generate useful secondary passions focused on the means needed to achieve the end. Wanting money immorally might fuel a passion for work and economy morally neutral or useful. Craving glory might drive a passion for diligent study and effort. The end might still be questionable, but the means often become productive. In fact, the text concludes, passion is essential for productivity. Any truly significant achievement requires focused energy, and that focus comes from passion. Artists, writers, thinkers, they succeed because they are passionate about their craft. Passion, when guided by reason and aimed at worthy goals, isn't just acceptable, It's indispensable for greatness.